Summer is finally here. Time to kick back, relax, and if you're lucky enough, enjoy the summer season at your cottage. For many owners, cottages hold a sentimental significance. It represents an important piece of family history and heritage, so careful consideration should be given if one would like to keep the property within the family. But what exactly goes into cottage succession planning? What should be included in an estate plan, will, or cottage agreement? And in addition, what tax planning strategies could be considered? Let's dig deeper into cottages, wills, and estates on this episode of the Upside Plus. Hi, I'm Emiliana Nuevo, and welcome to the Upside Plus. Creating an estate plan and having a will are always important, especially as you reach certain markers in your life: birth, marriage, death. And when a high-value property like a cottage is mixed into that picture, estate planning isn't just crucial, it can be a game changer. Family arguments and conflicts could be easily avoided if individuals communicate one's needs and expectations and have honest conversations about who would be best suited to take care of the family cottage as the years go on. So where can you start? I sit down with Fidelity Director of Tax and Retirement Research, Jacqueline. She discusses the importance of cottage estate planning and some helpful tax planning strategies around those properties. Jacqueline, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. Now we're talking about cottage succession planning, cottage estate planning. First things first, what should you consider when you create a cottage estate plan?
Yeah, so great question. Lots to consider for sure. So I would say right off the bat, the first thing to decide is, when do you want to transition the cottage? Do you want to do this during your lifetime, or is this something that you want to do upon your passing? And if it is something you want to do upon your passing, then you have to start thinking about, okay, who are you transitioning this to? Well, either way, whether it's in your lifetime or upon passing, you need to make that decision. You also need to talk to family members and see who actually wants it. A lot of the times we may think that the whole family wants it, but in reality, maybe if somebody lives far away, it's not something that's important to them. Maybe they don't have the money to actually be able to do the upkeep and that sort of thing. So what I would say is conversations with respect to the cottage are extremely important because that's where you're really going to figure out, what makes sense for this particular family, and maybe it makes sense to sell it to a third party. And sometimes that ends up being what the situation is. But as with everything, every situation is unique, and you really need to make sure you're diving into what suits your needs and the needs of your family.
Absolutely. Great overview there. Everybody's at a different point in their investment journey and chapter of life, but really important to have those conversations. Now, the people you want to pass it down to, are those the same people that you should assign as a power of attorney or an executor within this cottage estate plan? Can you sort of set out the difference?
For sure. So essentially, with a power of attorney, this is the individual who can speak for you in the event that you become incapacitated. So they're the one who speaks for you during your lifetime. Your executor speaks for you upon your passing. So with powers of attorney, I'm really happy you brought that up, because a lot of people feel that their spouse can automatically act on their behalf in the event that they become incapacitated. That's not the case. So they have to be the power of attorney for property to be able to make any decisions as far as the properties are concerned. Mm-hmm. And then also we have a power of attorney for personal care. So that's the person who makes all the personal care decisions. And you want to have these documents set up before there's an issue, because otherwise somebody would have to go to court. They would have to, make a case for why they should be the power of attorney. Chances are they'd be appointed right away, but it just slows down the process. Yeah. And then when we're looking at the executor, that is the person who's appointed in the will. So that is the individual that you say, this is who I want to actually settle my estate.
Upon your passing.
Exactly. Yeah. So you want to find somebody who has the time to settle the estate, mm-hmm. who has the skills to settle it. There's a lot of work that's involved in settling an estate. So you want to make sure that once you've chosen someone, ask that person if they're up for the role. Time and time again, people tell me that they found out they were someone's funds executor when that individual passed away. But there's a lot of important information to share between the two individuals prior to passing. So you really want to make sure your executor knows that you've appointed them.
Wow. See, I did not know the differences there. Really important to make those distinctions. And like you said, find that individual or family member who is well suited for that, right?
Exactly.
And not necessarily, it may not necessarily be your spouse. So really, really important stuff there. Thanks, Jacqueline. Now, what are some common questions and conversations family members should have around cottage succession planning? You kind of alluded to some of it in your first answer, but what types of specific questions should you be asking each other?
Yeah. So right off the bat, who wants the cottage, right? Do we want to keep it in the family? Do we want it to be sold to somebody else? Then the decision needs to be made. Say, everybody wants to have the cottage. If there are 3 individuals, well, then the question is, okay, how is that going to be split up? Mm-hmm. Generally we have about 9 weeks of good summer here in Canada.
Give or take 3 months. Yeah.
So how are those weeks going to be split up, right? You look at August long weekend. A lot of people like to take the week after August long weekend off. So does one child always get that week? Does that week flip, every year? How are those sorts of decisions being made? You also have to have conversations about upkeep. Who's going to be responsible for just general maintenance? If it's in the middle of a forest, clearing brush, making sure that, boats are put away at the end of the weekend, making sure that things are cleaned properly. And we generally recommend having, if it's a co-ownership situation, have a co-ownership agreement in place that actually dictates what the rules of engagement are, so that it's very clear to everybody exactly, how this is going to play out and what is the expectation, really.
Yeah, super helpful to have that agreement laid out and, like you said, that co-ownership responsibilities. Now, Jacqueline, when it comes to tax planning strategies around a cottage, around a high value property, what should you be taking into consideration?
Yeah, for sure. So unfortunately, there's no way to get away from tax. So when that property is transitioning from one generation to the next, there are different ways you can do it. So you can gift the property to the child. You can sell it for fair market value. So from a tax perspective, both of those work the same way. So essentially, you're going to have to pay tax based on what the fair market value of the property is. The child's adjusted cost base is now going to be what the fair market value was at the time that they purchased that property or at the time that it was gifted to them. Now, where we can run into some issues is, I know we like to give our kids a good deal, right? And so if you're selling the cottage for less than fair market value, you're actually putting it into a position where double taxation arises. Because as the owner, you still have to pay capital gains tax based on what the fair market value of the property is. But for the child, their adjusted cost base is whatever they paid for it. So if the property is valued at $1 million, a child pays $500,000, you're paying capital gains tax on $1 million, but now their adjusted cost base is $500,000. So not an ideal situation. Now, one way that we found is a great opportunity as far as transitioning the cottage tax efficiently is using something called the Capital Gains Reserve. So there's a section in the Income Tax Act that states that as long as you don't collect all of the proceeds of sale all at once, that you can split the gain evenly over a maximum of 5 years.
So that's helpful to know.
It is. Great. So you would do it as a virtual sale, essentially. So sell it either using a promissory note or a demand loan. And then that's why in that situation, instead of having to realize, say, a $500,000 gain all in 1 year, you can split that evenly over 5 consecutive years.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you do end up collecting extra proceeds of sale in 1 year, whatever the gain is that applies to that, you would have to pay that applicable gain. But if you're not collecting any money at all, then you can split it evenly between those 5 years. So that's a great opportunity and something we're finding that more and more Canadians are starting to use.
Amazing. All really great stuff, Jacqueline. And as we wrap up the segment, why is it important to tackle these conversations about your cottage about succession planning. Why is that so important for families and individuals? And what's the first step that they can take?
Yeah, so definitely super important because we've seen many situations where proper planning hasn't happened and people wanted to keep the cottage in the family and they just simply couldn't. Because what happens is that the cottage flows through the estate, it's then taxable within the estate. Some of these properties, if you look at cottages in Muskoka, some of them have massive capital gains on them.
That's right.
And so if that's flowing through a cottage, it's flowing through an estate, there may not be enough cash within the estate or other property to pay that massive capital gains tax. So we've seen many situations where people have actually had to sell the cottage. So what we're saying is make sure that you're doing proper planning beforehand. Start the process as early as possible. Work with your advisor. Make sure your advisor understands what you're trying to accomplish, because it might be an opportunity to have insurance money that pays out to the estate that can then be used to offset that tax liability. So having these conversations with the advisor are essential and really helpful through the whole process.
All right, so enjoy your cottage, but as crucial to have those conversations so the families and the generations next can enjoy the cottage stress-free.
Exactly.
Jacqueline, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We know laying down a solid foundation for your cottage property in the estate and tax planning realm is crucial. But what happens if you come across specific scenarios where family members have a change of heart when it comes to the property, or if other issues come about? How do you deal with more complex planning situations? I sit down with another of our tax and estate planning experts at Fidelity, Giselle de Sousa. She deals with high net worth clients with our private wealth team. Also joining us, Paul W. Taylor, partner at Borden Ladner Gervais. Paul focuses on trust, estate, as well as corporate law. Paul, Giselle, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. Let's get straight into it. Giselle, I'm going to start with you. What are some tax implications cottage owners should be thinking about?
So cottages, like homes, are capital property. And so when you sell a capital property, you'll have capital gains tax. So for cottage owners, something to consider is a lot of people's cottages have appreciated significantly in value. And so when they eventually sell or dispose of that property, there could be a pretty big tax bill. So with cottages, a lot of the time what you're thinking about is how you want to transfer that to the next generation, or if you want to sell the property. So if you were to sell the property, you'd have a capital gain on the difference between the sale price and your adjusted cost base plus any capital improvements that you made to the property. Your adjusted cost base, if you purchase the property, is the price that you purchased it for. But if this is a property that you inherited from a previous family member, it would be the difference, or it would be the amount that was reported on their tax return as the fair market value when they passed away. And so you might need to obtain their tax return to determine what that value is to determine your adjusted cost base. If you were to gift the property to a family member, again, you'd have to pay tax on the difference between the fair market value and your adjusted cost base. And when you pass away, there's a deemed disposition on death. So you'd deem dispose of the property at its fair market value, and again, you'd have a capital gains tax to pay, on top of which there's probate tax when you pass away. So depending on your province of residence, there's a different percentage of probate tax that would be applicable, and that's based off the fair market value of the cottage property. So a couple of different pieces to consider there.
Paul, you deal with a lot of these issues, a lot of these topics, dealing with cottages in trust. Are these types of topics and issues really important to talk to your family about in terms of the value of the cottage, when you want to pass it down?
100%. I mean, one of the big things we see when we're doing cottage planning is there's generally an inequality of who uses it, right? And who takes care of it and who pays for the bills. So open communication among the family is really important, because that's how you're going to figure out when you're doing the long-term planning, you know, is this something that one child wants to receive? Is it something that a few do? And it's those conversations that also sort of pull out some other issues. For example, if you have beneficiaries who are not resident in Canada or children not in Canada, right, there can be tax complications, because there's something called Section 116 of the Income Tax Act. We don't have all afternoon, so I won't go into it in too much depth. But all that to say that there can be extra filings required before the property can be transferred to a U.S. beneficiary, or even if the property makes up a big part of your estate, even if it's sold and it's just money, there can still sometimes be some complications. So those are, if you've got anybody who's outside of Canada, either owning it or as a beneficiary, really big thing just to make sure you get proper advice.
Absolutely. Now going back to you, Giselle, just the importance of estate planning in general, and if you have a high value property like a cottage, how important is it to revisit that estate plan and to talk it through with your family members?
Very important. So generally the guidance is you want to look at your estate plan every 3 to 5 years to make sure that it still aligns with your wishes, it still makes sense for your family situation. Mm-hmm. That being said, if you have any major life events, so any kind of changes in your health, marriages, divorces, anyone's passed away in your family, births of children or grandchildren, those are always great triggering events to say, oh, maybe I should look at my estate plan again and see if anything's changed and if the way that my assets are going to transfer still aligns with my wishes. And like Paul said, communication is key, making sure that family members are aware of what property exists, and then also you understanding if they are interested in owning that property in the next generation.
So cottage succession planning, we know it's important. Now, Paul, what if family members don't want to wait to pass down the property? I mean, we assume, okay, well, the children will get the cottage property once the parents pass away, but they don't want to wait that long. They want to figure out those plans and possibly pass it down to the children before that happens. How should you start with that plan? What kind of steps should you look at before doing that plan?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point here, because a lot of the times I see in my practice, we will set up a will, we might set up a cottage trust through the will, things like that.
Right.
But sometimes we have situations where, hopefully the parents are going to live a long time, but they might be getting older and not really want to do the maintenance, and it's the next generation that's going to step up. And so the key things to think about there is, you talked a little bit about the capital gain that would happen. So if you're going to set up a trust, or if you're going to make a gift or do something else in that Intervivos planning, you're probably going to trigger a tax disposition. Now, it might be that the principal residence exemption can apply, so maybe you can benefit from that, but you've got to look at sort of, if there's more than one property, maybe your home and your cottage, which one has the most benefit? So there's a lot of those sort of math type issues to look at. And at the same time, there's family issues to look at. If you have more than one child, but there's one child in particular that really uses the property, so you want to give it to them, are we going to equalize that child somehow? And if we're not going to do that until the person dies, how do you value that? If the cottage is worth $600,000 now, should they be getting a gift of $600,000 in 20 years? That may not be fair, because it might be worth a lot more at that point. So a lot of conversations to have there. My general preference is, if you're doing something major like that for one child and you can afford it, do the same thing for the other child at the same time, right? Or at least a similar value. One saying that we have a lot of that we use is, equal is not always fair and fair is not always equal. So sometimes the numbers aren't going to be exactly the same, because maybe I'm inheriting the cottage, but I'm still expected to host Canada Day or, May long weekend out there.
Yeah.
And I'm still expected to really host this as a family property, even though I own it. So maybe it's not dollars for dollars, right?
Right. And have you ever come across situations, Paul, where family members know how to treat the cottage, while they're just sort of visiting the cottage, but as they become cottage owners, the rules change, right? The responsibilities change. That's something to keep in mind. Absolutely.
And I mean, I think, when we look at, there's a big distinction between being a guest of your parents. And when I say guest, you could be a very useful guest. You could be the one who, cuts down the trees and gets the firewood going and all that kind of stuff. But there's a big difference between being a guest and being in charge of it. And one conversation that I find people don't always have is they say, well, Paul, he loves going to the cottage. Of course he's going to want to inherit the cottage. But I may love visiting the cottage. But if this is some lovely cottage property worth a whole bunch of money, I may love visiting the cottage, but I might rather have that money so I can pay for my kids' education and go on some nice vacation somewhere else. And I might be doing it out of a sense of obligation. So like I said in the beginning, those conversations are really important, because you don't want to assume that this is what someone wants, because especially if you're getting into more complex cottage planning, it can be difficult to unwind. So my general preference is, to have the conversations and to build in as much flexibility as we can.
Giselle, what other tax planning strategies could cottage owners and investors keep in mind?
So Paul touched on this briefly, but the principal residence exemption is a great consideration. So just high level, the principal residence exemption is that when you sell your principal residence, you don't have to pay income tax on the capital gain on that property. So the definition of principal residence means ordinarily inhabited, which includes cottage properties. So when you're looking what property to decide to use the principal residence exemption on, not to get too into the weeds, but you have to do a per year gain calculation. So you take the capital gain divided by the number of years that you've owned your cottage and your principal residence, your home, and see which has the higher capital gain per year to determine which property it makes more sense to claim the principal residence exemption on. And in cases where people have had cottages for decades, sometimes that is the property that it makes sense to claim the principal residence exemption on. If it's a cottage property that's primarily been rented out, you might not be able to claim the principal residence exemption. So it's certainly something that you need to discuss with your professional advisor to make sure that you're making the right choice for yourself, but also that it makes sense from a tax perspective. Another consideration is if you're looking to transfer the property to the next generation, or if you're selling the property, there's something called a capital gains reserve. So instead of you can have the sale over up to 5 years, you can have the proceeds received up to over 5 years, and then you would claim a smaller portion of the gain every single year because you're claiming 1/5 of those proceeds every year. And so that could reduce your tax per year by bringing you into a lower marginal tax bracket year over year. If this was a sale to a child, so a non-arm's length party or a grandchild, one consideration is that you have to ensure that the sale is at the fair market value. So sometimes you might be incentivized to sell it to your child at a lower value because you want to do what's best for them.
Member, sure.
But the CRA does say that any sales to non-arm's length parties are at fair market value. So you would pay tax based off the fair market value, but your child's cost base would be the price that they paid. And so when they eventually sell the property, there's double tax being paid there. So you want to ensure that the proceeds that you're charging a child is the fair market value. Yeah. And then one last thing to consider is if you own the property jointly with right of survivorship with a spouse, when you pass away, it will transfer automatically to that spouse. There wouldn't be probate on that, and you can defer the tax until the passing of the second spouse. So just a little way to defer tax until the passing, and then maybe they would do different tax planning based off of their circumstances.
Right. Now we can go on and on about into this topic, but before we go, Paul, what are some of the most common legal conflicts you've heard among heirs and owners of cottages, and how can that be prevented down the road?
That's a great question. So one piece of advice I do have before I get into that is if you're doing any major renovations or anything like that, keep your receipts and keep your invoices because you can reduce your capital gains that way. And in terms of fights with people who aren't the CRA, the main thing is I think differences in expectations. Because again, you're often moving from a situation where everybody was guests, right? Yep. And the parents are the folks who sort of drove the bus there and they were the ones who figured out, okay, who gets what weekend and all that. And there's a big vacuum there. And so there's a logistical vacuum, which, you can fill with something like a cottage agreement that sets out, who pays for what and the framework. And cottage agreements in a lot of ways, they're helpful in that they're contracts that can maybe be enforced, but they're more helpful in that they make you have the conversation. They say, okay, this is the framework of how we're going to make these decisions. This is how we're going to decide who pays for things. And you have that conversation in advance rather than after the fact. But a big thing to keep in mind is, there's a lot of sentimental attachment to these properties, especially once the parents are gone, because it's a link to them. Right. And so you often see, one child who maybe, isn't around and isn't somebody who's going to go there all the time. They're going to really want to keep maybe sell it and have the money to do their own thing where they live, and then maybe the person who was there more often has the opposite. Although I will say I've had the opposite occur. I've had clients where the person who was there every second weekend said, I'm good, and they bought their own place and that's fine. And the person who only came twice a year was really hurt by the fact that it was being sold, because to them it was that attachment, right? And it was that special weekend they had every year with their parents. And the best way to reduce all these things is communication. And it's much easier and much better to spend a little bit of time and even a bit of money on a lawyer. I'm not just saying that for my own purposes, but to get these things straightened out early rather than to fight about them later.
Absolutely. And Giselle, as we wrap up, anything to add to that in terms of creating an estate plan or revisiting that estate plan, like you said, throughout the chapters of your life?
Kind of echoing Paul's sentiments, it's definitely something you want to make sure you see your professional advisor about and communicate with your family. Make sure you understand their wishes and what they are looking to do before you revisit that estate plan.
Yeah.
Because the worst thing is to have them surprised when you eventually pass away.
Yeah. So get that cottage agreement started. It could spur on really important practical conversations, and get in touch with your lawyer and your professional advisor to go over all these topics when it comes to your cottage property. Paul,
Absolutely.
Giselle, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time, your recommendations, and your insights. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
We hope you gain knowledge on where to start with your cottage succession planning, the thoughtful elements that go into it, and what it all means for you and your family. Remember, consulting with your financial advisor is the best way to make the most of your financial future. I'm Emily Nuevo, and thanks for tuning in to The Upside Plus.